Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all. Thank you for joining us for this 10th in the series of
Hello,
uh,
I'm here.
Consultation Mondays. Those enthusiastically joining, thank you. Keep your enthusiasm for after the presentation. So I wanted to say briefly something about how we chose this topic of state-led global public goods provision and the potential UN regulatory role. First of all, to say that I'm Georgios Kostakos, the Executive Director of FOGS, and just back a few days ago from FFD4 in Seville, where we saw these efforts to keep alive development cooperation and financing for development within the existing framework and with more innovative means. We see that there is an increasing indebtedness problem again for developing countries. So that's something that we keep in mind. Developing countries end up paying more to the developed countries than they receive eventually. We have UN reform efforts, the UN looking again for its role in the current circumstances with less resources available to it because some big countries don't pay or pay late. And of course, we have the geopolitical tensions, wars, and trade competition, etc. In all of this, we see that some big projects of some big geopolitical players, like the Belt and Road Initiative by China, the Global Gateway by the EU, initiatives of the US, at least with the previous administration in Africa and elsewhere, even Indian and other Japanese and other initiatives have an element of providing public goods to the countries that they target or they cooperate with, while at the same time having a geopolitical dimension of increasing alliances, improving access to vital minerals, etc. So all this is the concern and the research interest of our trainee for this summer, one of our two trainees, Pratul Malthumkar, whom you see there and who has prepared the presentation for us. You may have seen already the concept note. Now he will give it to us in brief in a presentation, and after that we will have a discussion, and we look forward to your contributions that will also help Pratul complete his paper in the coming months. Thank you, Pratul. Please go ahead.
For sure, sir. Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you all for joining here. I've been very excited to give this presentation. And before I begin, I wanted to just say my thanks to Sir Georgios, who has been every day looking at it, trying to help me 1% at a time, and also Manan for facilitating it. I think this topic is very close to my heart because we're talking not just about UN, but we're also talking about state-led global public goods. Now, what does this mean? I think the topic means two things. Firstly, my job is to tell what these state-led global public goods are and in what shapes and forms do they take place. And secondly, which is more importantly the case, is what is the potential, which is why I've sort of put it in control I. Do we see some sort of potential of a UN regulatory role? If yes, how could that be? Now, we've all known that public goods usually, as per the standard definition, is exclusively for the public. But in practical reality terms, is that the case? Or is there a geopolitical angle that needs to be examined? Now, just to make sure that we're all pumped up and warmed up, please bear with me. We have a question which can sort of understand and analyze how we feel about this topic. And that question that I want to present in front of all of you is this. Now, the question is as follows. What happens in the first 2 years after a low-income country signs a major state-to-state infrastructure loan? This is a pretty intuitive answer, does not read any background information as such. I hope Manan will be sending the link. And then if you could just please cooperate with us, click the link. That would help us gauge and understand your perspectives on this topic and what you think is the ground reality.
Yeah, the poll link is in the Zoom chat.
Interesting. We're going to wait for 1 minute more before we give our disclosure of the result. I think I should have made this whole thing harder. Okay, last 20 seconds and then I'll jump back. I think it's safe to say that we clearly have a winner, which seems to me that option B is the popular vote. And it is also the correct answer. Congratulations to everyone who has put this. And also the person who's put FDI inflows double 2x. I am an idealist and I stand with you. So as much as I love to embrace option C, the correct answer is actually option B, which is external debt service rises faster than government revenue. Which what brings me to the primary argument of this whole presentation, which is what we think sort of state-led public goods deliver is far, far different from what the ground reality is. And I want to give that by talking about some of the projects here. The first one, which is also extremely popular, is the Belt and Road Initiative. Wanted to give some quick facts about this. By the Xi Jinping's government, around September 2013, this initiative was launched in terms of providing greater connectivity. In terms of its actual reasoning and rationale, this seems to be some sort of a dichotomy. It was presented as a corridor which will give reaping economic benefits. But if we take an insider look, we understand that the bigger cause of this was because China was literally suffering from success. Industry was overproducing at such a rate that they needed to sell it to member nations, not just companies, not just individuals, but member nations. That was a state of overproduction. And that's why the whole Belt and Road Initiative took place. Now, the unique factor, and that's why we also have to give credit where it's due, is that there has been some sort of success. And I think some is an understatement. There has been a growing sort of success with respect to how BRI's end goal has been taken place. Because for the other hand, if I'm a country in Africa, I may apply for a loan at the World Bank. I would be rejected because my credit rating is not that high. I may apply to IMF, I may apply to IFC, and I could be rejected. In those cases, what China offers seems like a dream come true to me. And what are those true benefits? Well, we have 4 benefits that's there to offer. The first thing is that the interconnectivity, especially around the Horn of Africa, which is a key hub, has been boosted by such a huge rate that economic activities and livelihood has been impacted at a positive rate. Especially at Pakistan, the port-led activities have also shown signs of development, and port-led activities also lead to tertiary activities being improving, thereby affecting the overall society. The third thing that we see is World Bank estimates that extreme poverty rates could be reducing. And then finally, now, this is something which could be stated versus actual reality might be different, but on paper, it does seem to give better trading conditions. You can see the picture here that the total value of investments is $1 trillion. It's as huge as almost the capitalization of Apple could be. If this seems too good to be true, what could be the biting factor? And I think what beautifully shows that is this income breakdown. It seems to me that China has done something which not even any NGO would do, which is giving loans to low-income countries at a far, far exceeding capacity than that to high-income countries. Obviously, this might raise some sort of suspicion. So where does this lead to for all of us? I think this leads to my case. The case that I want to present is that what we're having in terms of provision of goods is less public and more geopolitical. Now, why is that? One of the professors who I deeply revere, Francis Fukuyama, has stated recently in the Financial Times, whose quote I've just put in the snippet, is that the real problem is that poorly conceived Chinese projects have created a new round of sovereign debt crisis. We often say in India that there is a money multiplier, where if people park certain amount of funds with the bank, then the bank generate more funds later and everybody is having a benefit. In China's case, the opposite seems to be true, where they park some amount of debt and it just keeps on increasing and increasing like a snowfall level. Now, in terms of filling genuine infrastructure gaps, yes, I do concede to that. However, I think there are greater problems and we need to look at it at the granular level. Some problems are its debt turns, its secrecy. For example, a lot of the documentation that's there, it's only on closed door basis. We don't know how much carrot and stick policy is being used. We don't know the amount of persuasion or, on the worst case, pressurization is being used. Now, who are we talking about in terms of stakeholder? Who does it really, really hurt? I think the first thing which we need to understand in terms of stakeholders is a lot of these loans are not concessional, which basically means they're going to hit us back. And they're going to hit us back because if we only have a pizza pie, and if we take 1/4 of that pie for loans, and that loans is keeping on increasing, that remaining pizza pie cannot be used for health. It cannot be used for education. And mind you, these are already the countries which severely depend upon health and educational attainment. Secondly, there are some sort of confidentiality clauses and having some sort of transparency in financial instruments is one of the biggest and the most important factors that helps in making sure that the public goods are truly public. Would you trust your government if your government says that we're going to build a road, but then it doesn't disclose any of the facts? Which companies would be undertaking this? How long would it take? So obviously, that sort of confidentiality is surely going to bite us. Third thing is choice of law provisions, which I'm going to talk about later. And then finally, the increasing trend is that there's been giving long-term port and land leases. What sort of is happening as a trend is that it's happening as a benevolent lover, where PRC is giving a lot of loans, and instead of taking the extraction of interest, instead of taking the principal, it's trying to have a different equalizer. That is the equalizer of sovereignty, the equalizer of land. And that's what brings me to this picture here, which is you see this interconnection is such a beautiful way of showing how China is trying to increase its footprints overall. That even if a country which China seems to be an adversary, then China could go ahead, go around it, and completely encircle it. This has also been some sort of the Chinese philosophy that is make sure that the war is over even before it begins. Now, the second thing, which is also very interesting, is the EU's global gateway. Even when I've begun my research, I thought that because this was advertised as an alternative to Belt and Road infrastructure, this would be the true messiah of the project. In a sense that because it's European Union, it's going to ensure that it puts itself accountable to greater accountability norms. However, the true story is somewhat different. Now, who did this? The European Union was responsible for this. The European Union's particular aid budget was instrumental in making sure this project gets implemented. The core reason for this was to limit the Chinese influence. And you can see that right from Morocco till Georgia, we're having a huge sense of connectivity, almost as what you've seen in the previous picture. Now, the benefit that's there is somewhat symmetric as to what the BRI has stated. The only difference is that the European Union claims that it's more green, it's more renewable, and therefore it caters towards a sustainable development and is in tangent with the SDG goals. We can even see in the website here that the commitment that's there towards Africa is worth $1.2 billion. And therefore, we're going to have priority rail and hydrogen routes. The reason why I'm stressing green energy is important in Africa is because the amount of climate change that's there is acutely increasing in Africa, and therefore it becomes important before we ignore it. However, we also have a catch right around here. And what is the catch? Perhaps the biggest and the most startling find of this entire presentation is that in the name of infrastructure projects, there has been a violation of consent, there has been a violation of choice of livelihood, and there has been a violation of freedom to be and settle where you are. How does that take place? The first issue that we see is that the research also underscores the potential negative impact on human rights, especially when you're taking indigenous communities. For them, the entire community is considered as sacred. And when you're displacing them, where water is itself scarce, mind you, all of these projects, especially those on solar, need to have huge amount of water capacities. If you want to solve problems of the future, can we ignore the present? Is it justified to say the communities that, hey, look, the water is scarce, could you please relocate to somewhere else? We also don't know if the compensation is adequate or not. The second thing is that the unchecked power of businesses harms the provision of essential public goods. It's okay if we have business conglomerates entering this business. I'm not naive. I understand that at the end of the day, we need to have businesses also trying to prove in because they need to also chip in their profits. However, the extent of harm by which they claim their profits is the whole story of it. Why am I saying this? Is because, especially in Rwanda, the EU signed hydropower project risked at least 4,500 people out of their homes. Even if none of this seems to be persuasive enough, I would like to highlight your attention towards this snippet, which was given by the Oxfam study, which said that there was one report, and even UNDP said this, that in Peru, poor families had to take out mortgages, had to sell their lands to buy green properties, which is not even something that complies as a basic necessity, by making a substantial down payment. And this encourages individual debt, it pushes them into poverty. And it seems to me, and I could be wrong, that the biggest gain and the benefactor is these green company. Now, we can also see that only 16% of these global gateway projects invest in key developments such as health and education. So, what is the takeaway? It seems to me that sometimes what you try to defeat ends up becoming your identity in yourself. What European Union had celebrated as the alternative to BRI seems to have a lot of commonalities. And even the conclusions that was there, that is a final reduction in health and education, that is community displacement, seems to happen at an increasingly fast rate. It's not just European Union, it's not just Africa. I want to also highlight the focus on G7. This is a very interesting initiative. The Lobito corridor is a railway line connectivity. It does not claim to have or develop roads, energy power plants, but in a way, it is very specific and niche. This was done in around 2023 or 24 by the Group of Seven. The US has been a major partner towards this, but in terms of its actuality, it was done under PGI, and G7 took the principal and the clinical responsibility. Now, the unique factor was that obviously they'd want to build more railway corridors in these remote regions. The benefits are somewhat different compared to the two previous projects because here, railways have a peculiar strategic benefit. The biggest strategic benefit is that they seem to reduce the freight costs. They seem to reduce the amount of integration that's there. And the challenges to integration because railways can also help in communities traveling to other places. And construction and mining tend to create a lot of jobs compared to roads where you need to have a lot of expertise and a lot of development. It seems to me that railways is a bit more hands on, and therefore, employment and job construction work can happen at a more promising rate. However, like the projects I've said in so far, this project also plagues with a lot of problems. The case that I want to make here is that it seems to be less public and more geopolitical. Why? Lobito corridor, in contrast to all these corridors, has a heightened exposure for women, has a heightened exposure for girls, and has a heightened exposure for children because we don't know what's happening in these new camp towns that will help in developing railways. The bigger problem of this is that what is happening right now, as we're having this conversation, the rates of cholera, the rates of HIV and TB is increasing at a fast capacity. And this is because whenever we have an influx of construction workers, which is job employment opportunities, there seems to be problems with respect to who will be the main factor in governance of it. Because it's convenient to just shrug off the responsibility and play the blame game, the poor and ultimately the workers suffer the most. The third issue is obviously land acquisition and royalty allocation, because these communities have consider land to be very sacred. And then finally, I would like to highlight this that all three of these projects have had a focus on rare earth minerals. In European Union, we require cobalt and lithium for solar power plants. In China, we know that rare earth minerals is important to make sure that the trade balance is there. Similarly, in this project, cobalt is a very important reserve. However, when we take these critical earth minerals, its disposal is something which is completely unaddressed and leads to a lot of spillover problems. We've had Al Jazeera, which seems to me has written in a bold way that it is called the Lobito Corridor Modern Plunders. It stated that people who could earlier even have some sort of employment, no matter how bad it is, now are completely displaced of their jobs. And also UNDP, and this is noteworthy because UNDP usually tries to be diplomatic, has stated that there are and there could be a growing impact of human rights abuses. If that is not enough, we see other reports which state that there's forced eviction, sexual abuse, burning of settlement, which truly seem to negate all of these benefits. Now, there are also two projects, particularly the India Middle East Economic Corridor and the AGOA Act, which I want to focus on the next slide. Here is the big common thread, and here is the core of my argument. What seems to be the common thread, and why is it problematic? Because on the one hand, sure, there are problems, but if there's infrastructure and if there's these global public goods, then they're leaving these African nations in a better off state, and therefore these projects could seem to be justified. However, and this is my argument is that the ends that are there cannot justify the brutal means that are being employed. And the bigger argument that I have is, are these ends even being met? Because if we see in how the claim that there in China Belt and Road Initiative, it's being said as a win-win initiative, but the port leases are extremely long. The Chinese law can leverage it. With respect to European Union, we've seen forced purchase of green energies and forced debt. With the Lobito corridor, like I've just said, there's job losses. And finally, we don't know how the result is going there. And therefore, should the UN step in? Do we need an oversight agency is what we have? Because these projects are already happening, but there are already two other projects which could completely change. The first is India Middle East Economic Corridor, which is basically a corridor of India and connecting the Middle East. The problem is that because the Middle East in itself extremely volatile, the labor has become very cheap, and we have a lot of oversight concerns as to which places will it go. A lot of the places along the border are where migrants live. Connectivity areas are usually areas which connect the borders. What will be the future of migrants? We don't know this, and the future of Indian Middle East Economic Corridor seems to be at stake. The second is AGOA, which is Africa Growth Opportunities Act. Now, this act has been for around 20 years, but we've also had similar amount of critique, which is a lot of the newspapers claim that it has done more harm than good. And therefore, the crux of my argument is, where do we see the role of United Nations? I think there are some themes which I've touched upon, but the biggest themes is here it goes. First is adequate compensation to locals. Is there some sort of mechanism? Do we see adequate compensation to locals? With respect to UN peacekeeping projects in the past, we've seen in multidimensional projects, there are provisions, there are mechanisms for compensation. In these infrastructure projects, those are absent. Do we have any mandatory disclosure agreements? If there are mandatory disclosure agreements, we could also bring in social audits. We can also restrict the amount of, let's say, displacements that are taking place. But particularly more, what could the role of UN be as a moral policing force? Can it create a model labor clause which will ensure fair compensation, fair rights are being taken place, that the local ground level resources are not extracted incessantly? And can we have baseline surveys? Because even if we can't stop this exploitation, can we at least identify and acknowledge that exploitation is taking place so that we can have civic community and we can have NGOs stepping in? And ultimately, what sort of gender-based violence prevention toolkit can we develop to make sure that all these companies can have a sort of authority that they can comply with? I want to talk about one small niche before I go. I've made a lot of claims. Why do you have to trust me? It's because a lot of these projects that are there have had very ambiguous documentation. The biggest reason why there's been a term called predatory lending is that the lender decides the terms and conditions as to how the amount of money should be there. If you give me money, but if you want me to open my complete access to the borders, and if you want me to displace my communities, and if you don't give me a consultative role where I can address my problems, then your choice of law clause is causing me immense economic, human rights, and social problems. And that's what's happening. It's not just the BRI initiative, but I've just shown this as an example or a guiding light. We've seen an increase in the amount of laws, in the amount of clauses that is being there by the companies of China and by how China wants to dictate its terms. And the more it dictates the terms, the more it tends to extract the benefits. And so finally, I would just like to end this by talking about and leaving this presentation with 4 questions, which is firstly, can we have some sort of objective test? Maybe the UN can decide it. Maybe it can have a decision by state financed assets. When do we know in that line that a good stops being public good and it starts acting as a geopolitical tool? Second question, how do we know that the host states which inherit all these rules that are there can happen in a good manner? Can we make sure that there's any regulatory sort of compliance? Thirdly, and most importantly, there is no policing authority. Should one be established? And if yes, how should it take place? At the global level, the regional level, or should it happen at a comprehensive level? Obviously, these questions are only but the guiding light. I would love to find out what you think about it. And thank you for listening to the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pratul. You've done a lot of work, and the paper will be even more in depth when it is produced. Yes? Great. I just wanted to say that, of course, there are other initiatives that have been mentioned, some of them in the background note that you may have received, the concept note. And I wanted to mention, for example, the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, Japan, Tokyo International Conference on African Development. And if you consider peace or stability as a public good, of course, there are Russian initiatives to support governments by military and other means in Africa. So I mean, we can see a lot of these kinds of initiatives, which are, as Pratul, I think, clearly demonstrated, of dual use at least, in terms of providing the public goods, SDGs and related goods, but at the same time creating dependencies, advancing geopolitical agendas. And what is the role of the UN, the international community, regional organizations? Who is really keeping an eye on these initiatives, respecting the UN and global rules of human rights, etc. So with that rephrasing of the questions, Pratul's questions, and of course you can go back to the original ones. Pratul, you may want to put the questions in the chat also for everybody to be able to refer to them easily. The floor is open for your comments. Please raise your electronic hand, and if it doesn't work, put it in the chat. Who will break the ice? Because if nobody is ready yet, at least I don't see anybody immediately ready, I can ask Pratul. We can be critical about all this, but okay. I see Odile here wants to contribute, please. And if you can switch on your camera, please. So we can see you.
I'll try to do that, even though I'm not looking quite decent. I'm also trying to get used to the
It's up to you.
to the connectivity on this. Okay, I'll start my video. Okay, hi, my name is Odile Bulten. I'm a former UNICEF deputy representative. I'm retired now and I'm in Cape Town, and I've been following up a lot of the debates I'm very amazed by this presentation because it covers quite a lot. And I think it also across the board shows the different initiatives. And actually, like Pratul said, the strategic and geopolitical, let's say, impact of all these projects. Now, I agree with you, we need to have a regulatory body and the UN could play a role. However, remember that the UN is member states, and therefore we also have the P5s, which have a very heavy weight on some of these institutions and some of these decisions. So we would have to look at maybe having these government or intergovernmental agencies look at that, or the regional economic commissions also look into that, because then they would have a bit more of I would say, neutral kind of say or influence rather than directly into the UN, because again, it's nation states, again, it's government, and again, it's the P5, and they all decide what's happening in the world. So I think we need to keep that in mind. I would favor more of a working with international, intergovernmental organization and NGOs at the country level to actually, with participation from youth, from communities, to actually look at this project. Of course, with the support of technical people who are aware of these based on what you have presented. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you for your great comment and analysis. Pratul will answer, but let's take another question by Stephen Browning. Brown?
Hello, yes, very interesting, Pratul. Actually, at one stage in recent years, I studied the BRI quite closely, so some of these dangers that you raised are quite familiar. Let me preface this by saying that I spent a long time in the UN, and when I was in Thailand, our most successful project was to respond to the Thai government's request for us to pay for some extremely expensive but very competent American lawyers to help Thailand negotiate with the oil companies, which were then exploring for gas in the Gulf. And I use this because I have another question for you. First, to what extent are the so-called beneficiary countries actually aware of the dangers? And to the extent that they are aware of the dangers, why aren't they calling upon the UN to give them independent advice on whether they should proceed and on what conditions? Because if they are aware and they haven't called on the UN, then there's no role for the UN. I mean, that's my contention, basically. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Up to now, we had two former UN colleagues. We have seen this in practice, right? Both dealing with the UN system in the field. Pratul, would you like to respond in some way? Yes.
Of course. I mean, it's honestly amazing to hear from UN staff members and people who've worked, because at the end of the day, I'm still a student. But I think two very interesting questions. The first question raised by Real, I would say yes, ma'am. There have been some sort of, I would say, idealism in my PPT where I've talked about UN. I also have in mind a stronger role where intergovernmental organizations could play a bigger role. I see specialized UN agencies. I see secretary generals, maybe rapporteurs making extensive reports. And I see a lot of intergovernmental mix in this play. I'm aware of the fact that United Nations in itself, comprised of the P5, would be reluctant if they are the major players. And I'm unfortunate that I currently have no better response than to just hope that these intergovernmental organizations, like you've highlighted, would play a bigger role. And second question, which is which Stephen has asked, I would say, sir, that awareness of dangers is a very important aspect. Thank you for raising this. I think I haven't really covered that into much detail. It has been in some sort of a lukewarm capacity. For example, we've seen that the People's Republic of China seems to deny any of the dangers that is being there. For example, if it gives a 99-year port lease and it takes the sovereignty of some countries, obviously it knows it can benefit from that sovereignty, but it's going to claim that it's not. In those states and in those aspects, the UN would be having no role. However, like you've said, if we can have a strong lobbying force, could consist of lawyers, could consist of experts who can just act as a deterrent towards big companies, push for greater information disclosure, that would help, especially in the European Union zone. Because I think there's a difference here, at least with respect to the BRI. I think I would be a bit more pessimistic with it. But with respect to especially the G7 Lobito corridor or the European Union, a lot of these member nations just are not aware of the extent of dangers because these private companies are sort of perpetrating it and putting into a band-aid fix. They're claiming other things, but the ground reality is different. And nobody's able to reach the eyes and ears of these European Union countries because their lobbying is so strong. So if there is a deterrent force, like you've said, could consist of special lawyers or experts, I think that would be a fascinating story that I would like to hear one day about.
All right, thank you, Pratul. I wanted to introduce also the element of UN reform, as we said before, and to let you know when we see USAID basically being dismantled and the funding going to development assistance from many developed countries, certainly the European ones, been reduced because of military spending and other things which are not exactly supporting the SDGs. What can the UN country teams actually do? For example, as Odila understood, said, if there were a coalition of country team representation of the UN with regional organizations, regional commissions, civil society organizations like Oxfam and others, could they really create this group of lawyers and experts who could push back in the case of the EU when really the rules are not respected, but also hopefully in the other cases too of this provision of public goods by states? I don't know if Arthur has the answer, but Pratul can answer both of us. Thank you, Arthur.
Thank you. I found this a fascinating presentation, particularly because of its comparison between the different major projects and how many of them have the same weaknesses or the same hidden dimensions. And I think that's why a global perspective is important. I think if you take it only to the regional level, you miss that comparison between different parts of the world where many of the things are the same. And of course, we know that the global economy is the least managed of any part of the global system. It's carefully avoided any kind of responsibility. There have been very great lobbying to protect the interests of the neo-colonial system of corporations exploiting resources. The transfer of wealth out of the poor countries is always greater than the money going back into them. So you put your finger on a key element of a larger problem of a total failure to manage the global economy for the benefit of all of humanity, the common good of everyone. So I think that's extremely important. I think we clearly need to get more documentation, more studies like yours to point to the hidden weaknesses and the exploitation that is sort of below the surface, because I think that would help to build more international public support for some kind of mechanism. And in that context, I think the closest thing in the UN to this is the Human Rights Council, which investigates problems of human rights. Could we give a singular function to ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council, to have a kind of a rights-based perspective on how the economy is being manipulated for other interests than the goods of the people concerned? Maybe this is an area where we could try to be lobbying to strengthen that mechanism within the UN, which could take on the same kind of investigating function, pointing the finger, highlighting things that are going wrong, and trying to build more support for better governance at the global level. Thank you very much for your work. It's excellent.
Thank you, Arthur. We have two more questions, Pratul, from Madi, and then Lerato, who cannot raise her hand, but she wants to ask one. Madi. Please unmute yourself. You're breaking up, but we'll try to listen to what you.
Can you
want to
hear
say.
me?
Yes, now yes. Please go ahead. Oops, it seems we lost him. Lerato, until he connects again.
Yes, sorry. Afternoon, everyone. Pratul, that was a very, very good presentation. So, well done to you. I just wanted to say, sorry, I'm in South Africa. Our universities and a lot of the institutes in this country have done almost an excessive amount of work on China-Africa relations, specifically in relation to debts, loans, etc., etc. And one of the institutes, there's two of them in particular. I will leave their names in the chat room for you, so you can go and have a look. It was specifically the South African Institute for International Affairs has done and the Institute for Security Studies have both come to the conclusion that actually the majority of Africa's debt is not in China; it's actually in the United States and Europe. So that's where the majority of our debt repayments are coming or going towards. That's just a comment there. And then in relation to the libido corridor, I think you said that the United States is one of the largest financiers of the corridor's establishment. Is that what you were saying? Yeah. So just double check that as well, because I know for us, the Development Bank of Southern Africa, which is headquartered here in Johannesburg, is actually one of their biggest financiers. I think we've got almost more than 20% of the establishment of the libido corridor is coming from DBSA, which is not just a South African initiative, it's the entire region that has invested a lot of capital in it. But I'll leave that information in the chat group, in the chat for you, just in case if you want to just have a look. But well done. That was a very good presentation.
Thank you, Lerato. I don't know if Pratul has all the answers now. He can also, of course, follow up afterwards and in his paper. But I'm looking for Madi. He seems to be here, back with us. Could you make your comment, Madi? Okay. Yes. No?
Yeah, can you hear me now? You hear me now?
We can hear you barely, but please try to. Yeah. Right. Sorry, Madi, the connection is bad.
Now I have.
Let's leave it for the next round if we can. Pratul, have you written down comments and questions? Great, please go ahead.
Right, of course. So the first comment was by Arthur, sir. I want to say, sir, that what you're saying is something that I go 100% in compliance with. I think a lot of studies are important on this issue. I've also seen a report, which I'll just send the link right now towards, which talked about how there has been a comparison between a lot of these corridors versus what China has been doing. And the sort of difference, irrespective of the partner, is still the same. The real GDP does not tend to grow that much. And the existence of the project does not seem to give that much of a benefit that it intends to. I've just put the link for those who are interested in here, which talks about how there's been changes in the GDP. But I think I want to just extend that idea. That idea of yours of ECOSOC and HRC is brilliant. I have also myself read a lot about the rule of law toolkits. We can have some sort of these toolkits maybe as mandatory before or while or during these financial flows are taking place. We can also have better social audits. I look forward particularly to the responsibility of institutions like Human Rights Commission and UNHRC, and then trying to understand where the balance is. The second, by Lerato, ma'am, with respect to the institute that you said, thank you for sending the link. I will make sure I look at that link. And second, with respect to the debt repayment and China and US being the actual origin, I think the bigger idea that I wanted to convey was that, especially how it's happening right now in Africa, the debt settlements and the debt payment systems are seeming to have a lot of delay, irrespective of the place being China or irrespective of the place being America. I think the huge burden is being felt on the member countries, especially in surrounded in those corridors who are taking part in it. The second thing, especially with respect to South Africa taking a bigger stance in the Lobito corridor and financing it. I would have to say, because you've said I will also do my due diligence, I'll get back to it. And in my final paper, if those things are wrong, then I will be stand corrected. So thank you for highlighting it. I've noted it down and I'll get back to it.
Thank you, Pratul. Further questions, comments? When we talk about ECOSOC or others having capacity to, let's say, interfere or to have a monitoring of such initiatives that offer public goods at a price, who would initiate that? Would you think that it would be the country question which needs the resources would do that? Or would it be rapporteurs, special rapporteurs, the secretariat, who would try to keep everybody honest without being afraid of repercussions, retributions, or annulment of agreements or projects? Because I think it's not so easy when we say so. And it was said before, the P5 have particular weight at the UN, even in ECOSOC, they don't have a veto, but they can cause trouble in other ways. Who would be the honest person or institution in this case, or body, to initiate such processes? Or should it be something like a routine thing that automatically would kick in somehow? But I don't know if...
Of course. Thank you for the question, sir. I mean, in all honesty, I will try to answer this to the best of my abilities, and I have an answer. But I must concede, I have been in this earth far lesser than most of you all have been working in the UN. So a lot of my answers may not make sense. But especially with my research on multidimensional missions, which have been taking place in UN peacekeeping, in that history, we've seen that these missions, especially in Namibia, in Liberia, turned out to be successes, especially the UN mission in Liberia, because we've had a special UN force which did not use or did not have any sort of structured encounters of force, but instead had a multidimensional outlook. Now, so those partners who were there in multidimensional outlook were majorly UN, and this was because this was UN approved. I understand right now the times are different. It's not a UN mission where we're saving lives. It's an infrastructure project. Therefore, we can't have that same sort of architect. And ECOSOC may in fact be very redundant. In that case, I think I would like to put all of my money and on the basket of civil society organizations, organizations which are actively vouching out, which are reaching out towards the United Nations. I think they can play a very huge role in talking about and giving disclosure to people and giving that amount of public pressure to make sure and pushing for greater amount of disclosures. I may sound idealistic, but that has already been happening in countries like India. I've also read about in some countries where civic engagement can lead and advocacy can lead to greater amount of disclosure. So if everything else fails, I would put all my money on civil society organizations, and I would hope that they could muster the lawyers needed, or they could persuade those people who know in organizations of the UN, specialized bodies, to ask the rapporteur to make a statement and then finally get the ball rolling.
Yeah, advice, don't bet, or I don't know, don't put all your money on anything, but yes, it was a clear answer. Thank you. We see here also some comments in the chat that the SDGs, our common agenda, and the upcoming Pact for the Future are prime platforms, right? But the Pact for the Future has come, it's not upcoming. I don't know, maybe its implementation is. Do you think that they really offer the framework for also these to answer these kinds of questions and to take the kinds of actions necessary. And Madi, who could not connect properly, he has written his question there, right? It is, are these geopolitical and huge projects connected and related to the current big conflicts and wars around the world? Are they connected? For example, the recent conflict of Iran, Israel, or Russia, Ukraine conflict? If the answer is yes, what can be the role of the UN in solving these conflicts? What can be done in this regard? Thanks for your consideration. Pratul.
Of course, of course. I think timeline is a
Can I make a
wonderful question.
comment, please?
Yes.
So sorry for
Sure.
interrupting.
Who's that?
If I may. It's Abhilasha, if I may.
Yes, why don't you raise your hand, and I cannot see you for some reason.
I
Let me
did.
see.
I've
I'm
raised my hand.
sorry.
I'm sorry.
I was on the wrong side. Yes, I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
So it's lovely hearing Pratul, and it's lovely hearing the youth and their ideas and the enthusiasm and the motivation and all the energy that they bring to the to well, to everything that is the intention, especially. But so sorry for sort of raining on your parade, Pratul. Don't, like Professor said, like Mr. Kostakos said, don't put all your money into the UN and the idea that the UN will do everything. Currently, what's happening is, unfortunately, like I'm a education outreach coordinator with the UN Common Cluster Major NGO group, and also part of the civil society. There's a lot of noise that is made. There's a lot of work that is being done, and with the Agenda 2030, we are at the half point. Unfortunately, in the next 5 years, when we see that the SDGs are at a half point mark, but the SDGs are under an existential threat themselves. We all are hearing that the SDGs might not be there after 2030, and there's one particular I don't know if I should be naming, but we know that this world leader, he's hell-bent on destroying the UN. So I really don't know what is the UN going to do. So currently it's like a toothless tiger, not able to solve the one work that the UN is supposed to do, that is international peace and security. So yes, there's a lot of responsibility that the CSOs have, because the CSOs are going to fulfill that gap, because that's where a lot of our hard work and our intention goes into working with the grassroots and bridging that gap that the governments are not able to fulfill. But it's actually will require a lot of hard work and everybody's positive intention to stand together against the forces that are there, so that the work does not get diluted and the worst work does not sort of diminish it and finish. So just wanted to put my 2 cents there.
Thank you very much, and apologies for the delay in giving you the floor. It's great, and I'm glad we agree on the advice to the younger people to be moderately idealistic, but also, yes, to see practical ways of achieving what needs to be achieved. And I still not more question or comment from Kaudai, from the Kaudai.
Can you receive another 2 cents?
Yes, it's a lot more the value of your comments, all of you here.
Yeah, thank you for your time. So I'm thinking, because these issues are related to the companies, to the corporations, and the private companies, right? So normally, if there are economic issues like this, we bring these issues to court, right? If different organizations or companies are in a conflict, they often bring each other to court. So in this case, I think maybe like other speakers said before, the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council, maybe they are too busy to address these issues. maybe we can bring these issues to the international court or some other civil courts instead. But in those cases, we must be prepared that there are a lot of costs involved. For example, to hire lawyers, and in the case of similar conflicts related to oil companies, like in South America, if as much as I know, they kind of the indigenous communities, they could not they really could not they struggle against the big oil companies, and finally they could achieve nothing. And even the lawyers were, they were imprisoned, like kind of imprisoned by their own government, by the US government. So we need to be prepared for those scenarios. So that's my 2 cents. Hope it's clear.
Thank you very much. Pratul, yes, can you go back to all these nice comments? Interesting comments.
Of course. Firstly, I'll start with the comments and then the question on timeline. Ms. Singh, I think your comment is duly taken off. I understand that a realist perspective is also very important, and thank you for bringing me towards the attention of the civil society and why we need to have a different framework and not just rely on UN and civil society. This reminds me of one of the conversations that I've had with the executive head at International Finance Corporation. And I think the IFC, in one way, maybe some sort of, in a different capacity, offer a guiding light of positivity. Because we've seen the nature of a lot of these projects. I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative is infrastructure. But right now, the growing trend seems to be towards green energy, towards clean energy. And recently, what has happened is that the IFC has collaborated with Malaysia towards building greener energies, towards building greener fuels. And that has happened in a very transparent manner. At least that's what he told me, that it was a success. We did it in an extremely transparent manner. We've built whatever we wanted to. The companies that were there privately, we also engaged in a PPP with them. And that sort of framework was good. So I think maybe what we can do instead is, instead of private parties or actors having just 100% go towards this, maybe engage in a 50-50, maybe engage in a joint venture, give them limited managerial capacity, try to involve organizations like International Finance Corporation in this, especially with what Kaldai said. I agree with you. I think oil companies in general is something which is always, it's said to be in the nature of dirty business. And you put your hands in the oil and then your hands just also become dirty. I think that's why there are certain industries which I think I'm very less optimistic towards, particularly that being infrastructure, that being oil. But I think there are other industries, like we've talked about Gateway, which talk about energy. And I think for these upcoming projects, we can make sure that those sustainable development goals are met by having IFC in place, by having companies in place whereby we can exercise a joint venture. And so I also want to just slightly comment on the timeline thing, which is because I said there's a geopolitical angle. Are the geopolitical sort of wars, conflicts making an angle to this? With the BRI, no, it was in 2030. That was purely because of economic overproduction. But with the PGII, which was around 2020, 2021, you could still see the effects of the Russia-Ukraine crisis just happening. And therefore, we could see some sort of that hint being there, that the gas pipelines and that infrastructure and all those profits that's there for these oil and gas companies maybe cannot be going and sitting around Europe. And maybe they need to shift. And I think that's why that African shift played some sort of a role. Again, this is just my economic understanding, that they wanted to spread and sort of lessen their risk. And that's why take these chunks away from Europe. But I also think that the growing lens from here, 2025, will be increasingly geopolitical. The reason why the IMEC, which is India Middle East Economic Corridor, to this day is only conceptual, is because of the entire Middle East acting like a global hotspot of crisis. So we still have a lot more projects underway. What has happened for bad has already happened for bad. But what is there for the future, which is for energy, I think by having some sort of these, by putting IFC in place, maybe we can tinker down its effects.
Great. Thank you. We have at least one more question in the chat. Of course, Pratul, you're not expected to be a specialist in everything, and we're not going to give you the PhD here, but I'm sure you're going that way, first year masters. But the question is, when is loan cancellation possible? What are the criteria required, and what are the strings attached to debt cancellation? If you have any idea about that. Also, you're asked to share your PowerPoint. I suppose that's not a problem, and we'll find a way either to put it on the Monday Consultations webpage, where we'll have also the video of this discussion pretty soon. We can also have a link there to Pratul's presentation, but we can also send it by email to those who registered, whatever you prefer, right? Good.
Of course. I will send the presentation ASAP. I will also do my fact check on the South African part, and then see that if there's any South African bank or institute that has been playing a global role, make sure that it's fully accurate, and then that presentation should be out for release. Loan requirement and criteria, I've read some of the documents of how the IMF and World Bank give their loans. A lot of these loans, and the fundamental difference between an aid from the World Bank and IMF versus member countries themselves pushing in, is that when World Bank gives it, it puts its criteria in development indicators. That is to say, in terms of multidimensional poverty index, or in terms of its human development index, what are its standing? How much could that increase be? And what will those factors be? But when we take this completely different and we put this in terms of member nations, that's why I've put that snippet of choice of law clause, which is China has put completely different terms for its loans, for at least especially for the BRI. And it seems to me how this is proceeding is, how much compliance can you give us? How much in terms of freedom or how much of land can we have some sort of a free ride access to? Are your markets okay? Can we penetrate in your markets? And then finally, how much of that pizza can be taken as our share? Now, this obviously should not be the grounds of how loans are given. I may want to protect my sovereignty, and I can still have development in my multidimensional health index. And in those cases, the IMF and World Bank would give me loans, but these member nations don't. So I think the criteria of how loans are given is also something which should be adequately studied.
Okay, great. I'm not an economist and I won't comment on this, but thank you, Pratul, for not being afraid at least to start with an answer and to get the discussion going. We hear, I don't know if Madi would like a bit more of an answer to his questions about the wars that are happening and how they are connected. You already talked about the Indian initiative in the Middle East, or Russia and Ukraine, why the Europeans perhaps are more, and the G7 more interested in showing something on the ground. But anything more you would like to comment on that?
You've summarized it perfectly, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we have a comment from Sudha Reddy. Given the current and emerging context, it has become increasingly difficult for civil society organizations to operate effectively at both national and international levels. Apologies for the somewhat pessimistic tone. So how does that compare with your optimistic tone about civil society's role?
No, of course. Thank you, ma'am, for that comment. I think I don't really see a clash. So my optimism that's there, it's towards the advocacy part of it. I still think in terms of the capability index, the biggest capability that's there of civil society organization is producing that research output, talking and pushing towards more sort of accountability and transparency norms and mechanisms. And I think the civil society by the research is already doing an amazing job. The only question is, in terms of a moral authority, who is that? I've said my hope is civil society and organization. After this session, I think that is going to switch. I'm going to maybe put not all my eggs in one basket, probably some of them in IFC, some of them in IMF, some of them maybe Rapporteur, some of them in some other joint venture companies who've already had a good score and it's not like these companies are the first to invest in Africa. There's been tons of companies who invest in Africa, and there's been global conglomerates as well, trying to focus on success case studies, trying to see how did those companies succeed, and maybe incentivizing them towards building more infrastructure could always be something. So I think that's my final response.
Yeah. Thank you. I think Abhilasha was enjoying the fact that the bet is changing already. Is that it? If you want to make an additional comment?
Yeah, no, it is.
Sorry, Prathul. Sorry for that. So sorry for bringing in the pessimistic angle to a very enthusiastic and a very hopeful conversation here. But I have a question. Like in all of this, we will need to look at the angle of equity and how do we prioritize equity for the vulnerable communities and the underdeveloped communities, because they always remain at the receiving end and sometimes do not receive what is their fair share.
Of course. Thank you for the question, ma'am. I think, especially with respect to how we're putting equity, I think in terms of its promised deliverables, that is to say, especially Project Gateway, they said that we're going to give you electronic green energy, and it's going to completely reduce your budgetary costs, and you can have increased efficiency. So if I was looking at efficiency, and I'm pretty sure some of the research papers have looked at the same, they compare at economic means, and they compare that economic gains that they get versus the amount of perceived cost, both social and both economic. Let's say for that power plant to happen, which may be right near my home, and that may reduce my need to go ahead and depend on coal or purchase coal. If I'm still having to displace to another community, have I been given adequate grounds where I can find housing, or have I been received some sort of aid? We find that especially with the BRI and Gateway, that has not been the case. And the reason so is that these companies were the ones who were given the primal charge. And I think in those ways, my version of equity, which some of the papers has said, is just who is having the greatest harm and how can we reduce that amount of greatest harm?
Permission to ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
Thank you. Prathul, just to add to that, have you, well, the universal income for all, have you heard of? So the universal income for all does not fit entirely into the energy and the goods and services for the vulnerable communities. But do you think that some part of it can be worked, or is there some hope for it that, say, it's a supplementary income for all or universal income for all? And that's a formula. So maybe something can be adapted from there.
Of course, yeah. I think we need to have the SDGs have already said that whatever criteria they've had needs to change because energy security is also affecting your economic livelihood. So I'm also actively looking at those indicators. I don't have anything concrete right now, but on my final research paper, I'm trying to find out those best predictors and then use them as the final benchmarks as to deciding the effectiveness of a project.
Thank you. Thank you. Prathul, would we be able to have your email?
Of course.
Of course, if you want to share it in the chat, yes.
Thank you.
Of course, always info@fox.org. If you have not got the other emails, we will facilitate contact. But Prathul may want to share his email anyway. And of course, as I said, you have to wait for the final paper. When is it expected, Prathul? You think?
No comments.
By the end of the summer for the Northern Hemisphere. Yes, it should be there. Any other comment, question? I don't know if the Kaudai Center, the hand has been left there from the previous question, or you would like to ask a new one? Okay, that.
Well, actually, I forgot to lower the hand. So, in general, I think maybe it's better to prevent these issues than to correct them, right? So, so the folks here are talking about how to prevent that already, in terms of metrics and best practices and stuff. So I think that's a great. Those initiatives are great, and so we need to we can learn from projects like this, right? So maybe countries or maybe some advisory body can be established to, or maybe even CSO, civil society organizations can be established to facilitate countries or countries or regions to learn from these practices and to prevent these issues in the future. So thank you.
Thank you. Yes. If allow me, Pratul, to say that, yeah, I saw that in the FFD4, some coalitions are being formed among different civil society organizations. Some are activists, some are think tankers, some others are perhaps more diplomatic, like connectors or behind the scenes track to diplomacy operators in a good sense. So these things seem to be coming together in view of the big problems. And if we had a UN secretariat also, I would say, and UN bodies with middle powers and others who have a more interest in the common interest, then we could get the critical mass that we need to start really having prevention and really oversight of these projects, which are also needed. All this money that exists, if it's invested in, I suppose, in infrastructure is good, but what are the terms and conditions under which that happens? What are the secret deals or expectations, and what eventually is the net outcome of all this, which, as Pratul made us realize through that poll, it's not what we would like to see. So if there is no other comment or question, I will ask Pratul to conclude, yes, to tell us what he understood, what's the next steps for his paper, and what he would like to see from the rest of us, perhaps.
Of course. Thank you everyone for the comments. I've noted all of them down, every single comment, question. I will try to improve the paper. It's still a work in progress. I'm sorry that I don't have concrete answers to a lot of the questions, but I will try my best to address it. And my final comment is this: I think we're heading towards a lot of uncertainties, and the solution, I would say, it relies on all of us. And so when you go towards the next conference, I would hope that you would be the leading change for us.
Yes, hoping for the best, and it's up to all of us here to do our part. Yes, thank you, Pratul, for really, I think, inspiring us here, and we can see it from the responses, and we look forward to receiving your presentation and, of course, to seeing the paper eventually. Just to let everybody know that thank you all for being here with us once again, some of you, some for the first time, that we're going to have our next Monday consultation in 2 months from now, on the 15th of September. And the topic will be shaping global governance through middle power capabilities. That will reflect the research and the paper that should be ready by then of our other trainee for this year, Rowan Liu. And we thank the young generation for their involvement, and Pratul for this one in particular. Take care and enjoy the summer for those who are in the Northern Hemisphere, at least.